It's Michael Lewis-Beck, who is already here on stage. He's the F. Wendell Miller Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of Iowa. He's been an associate editor for the International Journal of Forecasting. The journal has continuously invested and add political forecasting as one of the topic areas that we cover. And Michael has made a great contribution over the years. And this continues with another associate editor now that he's not with us anymore. He's still acting as an associate editor for a French politics journal, which is interesting. Michael and I have common interest with French and Danish politics. We were just discussing, actually, one of the many books that Michael co-authored is about the Danish voter. So that must be interesting. He's had many visiting professor position in Germany, in Denmark, in Belgium, in Italy. And it's a pleasure to have him today to discuss some topics in political forecasting. So the floor is yours, Michael.
Thank you. Thanks. So, okay. Kevin, does this sound okay? Yeah, okay. All right. It's great to be here. This is a great association. I want to thank Mark and Pierre and the other members of the board and for inviting me, and Pam especially. She's my lodestone there. She keeps me on the straight and narrow. She's coming down here to greet me now. Pam, you can sit down. I've been doing forecasting of elections a long time. I mean, basically since 1980. And I published a number of pieces on that. One of the things I want to do is promote forecasting in the discipline of political science, because when I started forecasting elections, I would write papers and send them to journals, and the journals' editors would send them back to me and tell me that it wasn't good science. So unlike in economics, where the idea of forecasting is part of the science. So it was really not a scientific enterprise back in 1980. I mean, the notion was that we were political scientists, we're social scientists, and they were supposed to explain things. But prediction was Monday morning quarterbacking, it was gambling, it was déclassé. So that's changed a lot now. Election forecasting is actually quite a growth industry in political science. And one of the reasons what piece of evidence here, I've got a lot of co-authors on this presentation, and these people are people I've co-authored one or more papers with on this subject, and they'll get referenced. These are not the only co-authors I have, but they are some. And before I get into the meat of the material, and it just dawned on me, or I'd have it. Well, okay. If you see on this page, the front page, Deborah Leiter, University of Missouri, Kansas City, all these people are political scientists. Well, except my son, he's a statistician. We'll forgive him for that. So they're all political scientists otherwise. And in the American Political Science Association, which has 12,000 members, they have groups, different study groups. And there's a political forecasting group. It's called Political Forecasting Group. They forecast anything political. It could be a war, a budget, anything that's out there that can be forecast in the political realm. They work to promote forecasting. Now, it's real hard to become a member. You have to write Deborah Leitner, who's the secretary-treasurer of this group. I'm past president. You write Deborah Leitner, send her an email, and tell her you want to be a member of the political forecasting group, and then you'll be a member of the political forecasting group. So, and the members, the more members we have, the more panels we can have at the big meetings. So, and there's no cost, other than the time. So I would encourage you to do that if you would. All right, so there are different ways. I'm going to talk maybe 20 or 25 minutes, and then I want to leave a lot of time for questions. So I encourage questions during the Q&A. I'm going to save time for this, so I'll go over some stuff, and when I hit in 20 minutes probably, in 20 minutes I'll stop and we'll take questions. There are different ways of forecasting elections, different general ways. Political economy modeling is something I've done a lot of, and we will start with that as an introduction. The most common way is vote intentions, or otherwise known as polling, political polling, where you ask people who you're going to vote for. That's the most widespread forecasting device. Another one, I'm at University of Iowa, and the IEM, the Iowa Electronic Market, is at Iowa. Many of you know that. It's in the business school. I work with those people too. If you have questions about that, I'd be happy to answer them, but I'm not going to talk about the IEM in particular. I'm going to talk about political economy models very briefly, and then look at survey approaches. The main survey approach is public opinion polling, and the question is, who will you vote for in the next election? Who would you vote for in the next election? Now the hobby horse I'm riding today is what I call citizen forecasting. And I wrote the first paper on this. I think this was the first paper that introduced this idea. Citizen forecasting is very simple. You just ask people, who do you think will win? Not who are you going to vote for, but who do you think will win, irrespective of who you're going to vote for. Very simple strategy. And I'm going to make the case that is clearly a better survey strategy than public opinion as we know it. So that's what I'm going to develop here. And I know you come from different backgrounds, so some of this stuff will be trivial, some of it will be mystical, but it'll all be interesting. I promise that. So, okay. Now, with regard to the political economy model, this is one of the earliest approaches. I'm scattering some citations throughout the paper. If you want to follow up on citations, now this is something some of you maybe are grad students. I get written about this. A really quick way to catch up on the literature is to find the CV of someone who writes in that area. Like, get my CV and then just read all the stuff I wrote on forecasting. I mean, it's all there. I mean, not all of it, but it'll lead you through the literature. So that's one tip. So the notion behind political economy models is you have a theory of voting. Like in political science, we have theories of why people vote the way they do. It's a social science. Social scientific theories about why people vote the way they vote. And from these theories, we construct models. I'm very partisan to simple models. And the simplest model is a model based on essentially primary political and primary economic issues. And that's the simple equation here. The dependent variable is vote for the incumbent party. Okay, that's what we want to predict or forecast. The vote share or the seat share for the incumbent party or the party coalition that's ruling. Okay, that's the main target for forecasters. And then you say, okay, is the party in power, how likely is it that they're going to win re-election? And you look at, in this stylized version, you take a measure of government approval. In the United States, it would be presidential, how's the president doing in his job? And then you take an economic measure, it's usually growth, mostly growth. So in the U.S. case, the paradigmatic model is the support for the party in the White House as a function of how that president is, what's his approval, his or her approval rating 6 months before, and what's the economic growth rate in the first 2 months of the election year. That simple model works very well. And so I'm going to look at just some simple stuff here. These are two bivariate regressions. The first one, the one on the left, it regresses the vote share of the president's party as a function of presidential popularity. You know, I have for this talk, I have 6 backups. I have backups all over the web and the world in case this gets lost. So the figure on the left regresses GNP, and notice we do use GNP, and the reason we use GNP is it fits better than GDP. And it used to be a more popular measure. So on the x-axis is GNP growth in the first 6 months of the election. And then on the y-axis is the percentage of vote, two-party vote. By two-party, that means Republicans plus Democrats. That's 100%. That percentage share of the popular vote is what's predicted. And you see on the left that the economy has a nice fit predictive power for a reasonably good predictive power for the elections from 1948 to the present, and then on the right is presidential popularity has got an extraordinarily tight predictive power with respect to how the president's party will work. So these are now this is disarmingly simple, but it's powerful theoretically because it's not a far-fetched argument. The argument that people care about the economy, and they care about how the president's doing his job. Very straightforward, bread and butter kinds of arguments. So this is we fitted this model in an OLS equation, and this is a quick look at how correct this is. These are ex-ante forecasts since across the election span 48 to 2020, and the question is, how often was it correct? And by here we mean correct is that it correctly predicted that the party in the White House would lose or it would win. I mean, it got that correct, and that was correct 16 out of the 19 elections, and it's been correct in a string since 1980. It's never missed, including in the last election. So, okay. No, wait, I should have. Okay. You saw that? No. Okay, I'll get that one there. That's the one that okay. So, the political economy model has advantages. It's theoretically powerful, it's parsimonious, it's transparent, it's got lead time. But it's limited in the sample size. It's small samples. And that's something, well, we know we can't simulate presidential elections. We just have them. So one of the problems in 2020 was it happened during COVID, and measuring the economic growth, I don't need to tell this group, measuring the economic growth was, oh my. We can go into that, but okay. Nevertheless, that worked. Now, now I'm going to talk about citizen forecasting models. In this slide, despite my minions working on this slide and me reading and rereading these slides umpteen times, this caption is wrong. The caption should be citizen forecasting. We're done with political economy stuff. The political economy approach is widely popular. It's used by many political scientists. It's basically a regression model using simple time series techniques. Now we're going to go to citizen forecasting. And the citizen forecasting idea, okay, I will say again, it's based on you take a national survey or a constituency survey, a district survey of the voters in the district, and you say, who do you think is going to win? Okay, that's simple. It's an expectations. And there are a couple sources of this. This is sometimes just called the wisdom of the crowd, and it goes back to the Galton experiment with the ox. You probably all know that. And it's also based on, let's see, Pierre, and there's Laurence is here. The French contributed Condorcet, and the Condorcet jury theorem is really one of the most important theoretical reasons why this technique works. Yeah, and we can talk about that, but I'm going to just tell you that's a fundamental theorem behind why these things work. And the other thing that drives people crazy is you don't have to have a probability sample. Now, I'm a big-time supporter of scientific probability sample in the strictest sense. But for citizen forecasting models, you generally don't need a probability sample. And there are reasons for that, but that may come up in the Q&A. So the first paper that we did on this was with Andy Scalaban, who's a grad student, and this came out in 1989. It came out in British Journal of Political Science. We took the American National Election Study, which is the flagship survey data in the U.S., and it's all probability samples, and we looked at the question. There's always a question in there, who do you think will win? We looked at those questions, and we found out that people generally knew who was going to win. It was not only significant, it was like 70-some% of the people in the sample, just citizens, they could foretell the election. So that spurred us to, we replicated that study with Charles Tien and I, and that paper was an IJF paper, 1999, Lewis-Beck and Tien. That's on this list. And in that paper, we found that 71% of the voters correctly forecast the winner. Very nice paper if you want to give something to students, and there's a lot of stats in there, but the stats are accessible. So what I'm saying, we started to build on the U.S. case, and then Andreas Murr, who's, some of you may know his name, he's German by birth, he's a political scientist at the University of Warwick. And this is one of the great things that happens to you when you're a reviewer of a journal, for a journal, is you get a paper like, say at IJF, you're reviewing for IJF, and you get a paper to review, and you read it, and you think, oh my God, this is great. I have to contact the author. Now that's happened to me twice in my life. And this guy, Andrew Murr, his paper he submitted to Electoral Studies was so good, I wrote the editor, and I said, after this is decided upon, if you take it, will you let me know who wrote it? And it's Andreas, and he's a genius and a fine fellow. He's been a major theoretical and quantitative force in the work. He dropped this citizen forecasting idea down to the level of the United States. We have 50 states, and he actually, from this non-probability samples of peoples in the states that were not even intended for this purpose, he showed you could predict from those state data almost every election correctly. So that was quite path-breaking. To take this up to 2020 was, Trump-Biden. It worked there. Surveys in the states by, here the citation, Huber and Tucker, that managed to predict the Biden outcome, and even using Electoral College, which, as we know, is the real way, the final way to select U.S. presidents. So it worked in that 2020 election. Now, this technique is not unique to Anglo-Saxon systems. I mean, my French friends, they love the Anglo-Saxons, but not really. I mean, they always talk about le capitalisme sauvage and les Anglo-Saxons, stuff like that. And that, I like to say, the French, it sounds so innocent, but in fact, I mean, this technique works for the French system, and it works for multi-party systems. It's not just because the U.S. and Britain are Anglo-Saxon, or they're essentially two-party, or they were two-party. You can do this in multi-party systems. You can do it in high-income countries, low-income countries. Yannick Defresne is a Quebecois, and he's done brilliant work on the French case. André Murr, who's German by birth, he's done a nice piece on the latest German elections. So the technique is not constrained to a few industrial countries. Now, I also want to point out that one of my co-authors is Mary Stegmeyer. Mary is now the associate editor for, if you write a paper on electoral studies, election forecasting, it will go to Mary, probably go to Mary as associate editor. And by all reports, she is a great associate editor, and I'm happy about it. She was a grad student of mine, and she's at University of Missouri, and she travels all over the world and does election forecasting. So, now, let's move on here. Okay. I told you about that, vote intentions versus vote expectations. And the question is why, may puzzle a lot of you, why do these people, everyday citizens, why do they manage to forecast who's going to win? And part of the reason is social networking. And Deborah Leiter, who I just mentioned earlier, she co-authored a paper that looks at social networks. So the idea is, originally this paper came out in the British Journal of Political Science. It's called Voter Intentions versus Vote Expectations. Just came out 2 years ago in the British Journal of Political Science. I wanted to call the paper Two Heads Are Better Than One, and that's the idea. You yourself are one forecaster. You can forecast your vote maybe, but when you start thinking about other people, you think about how your friends are, you think they're going to vote, and that improves your skill. That's one of the mechanisms, is that your network and how they forecast. So, okay, what do we got now? So the two countries where there's been the most research are the United Kingdom and the United States. And what we see, and these are papers listed here. Some are even the ones that are ex post doesn't mean that the data are, if you could have gotten it then before, it would have been ex ante, but we didn't know that until too late. We've actually done some ex ante studies. The most recent one by Andreas Moore, ex ante on the 2016 elections. It's in the United Kingdom at the constituency level. And the UK case works remarkably well. I'm going to focus now on the UK data, okay? This is an example of the UK case, and what you see, the top line, there are two lines here. The top line is the accurate prediction for the constituency, that is the winning party in this constituency, and the lower line is the vote intentions prediction. And you see across these elections, the citizen forecasting works better. Now, I'm going to show some results that expand upon this and do, let's see, look at the aggregate level and then the individual level. Okay. So, some of you are British. I mean, the Brits are great for data gathering. The Fabian Society and all this stuff. They have data. There's so much data. So we gathered lots of survey data from Gallup and other organizations beginning in, we started with the 1950 election. So 1950 to the present, we have all these elections. And we have, 449 months where the question of vote intention and vote expectation was asked in the same survey. That's over a long period. That's by far the most data available. And then we want to see how they work. And what we see in this study is, there's the data sources. And looking at this large pool time series, we see that the voter expectations were correct 72% of the time. Vote intentions were only correct 62% of the time. So quite a difference. Now, here's an example of how that would work. This is predicting the Labor Party seat share in 1987. So the dependent variable is seat shares for Labor, regressed on a lag seat share variable, and then the expectations that the Conservatives would win and the expectations that Labor would win. That's the simple regression equation. You use that to predict. And these things are measured in advance. You use those and that particular one was quite accurate in 87. Here's the results across all of these. We use different specifications on intentions to give intentions as much chance as it could to best the expectations variable. And what we see is that expectations worked. Once you identify in Britain, they always are changing the boundaries of constituencies. So to control for that, we selected the constituencies, the boundaries hadn't changed. And those voter expectations were right every time in this series of elections from 87 to 2017. So that is some pretty strong evidence. So the point of that is if you get this aggregate citizen forecast in advance, you can count, I mean, nothing always works, but you can bet 5 pounds on that, okay? Now, I want to switch to vote intention. So this is individual level. I mean, voter expectations. What's the source of a voter's expectation? Well, some people say voter expectation is simply a projection of your voter preference. If you're conservative, you will say conservatives win. If you're Labor, you'll say Labor's going to win. And so there's no real content in the expectation. This equation, this graph here, yeah, you see it, okay? On the y-axis, the dependent variable is voter expectation of the individual in an individual survey. All these and the surveys have different color lines. That's each line is the survey data from that particular election. And what we did here is we added, how far out, how many months it was out. Then we added, what did we add? We had demographics. And, okay. And if you add the demographics, you see that the dependent variable is an R-square. It's the fit of the model. And so as you add these things, you improve the prediction of the individual level forecaster's ability. So distance from the election, the less that is, that improves the forecast. The demographics, which are the standard SES demographics, certain groups predict better than others. For example, educated people can predict, college-educated people, or the higher your education, the better you are at it, okay? Then the other thing is your vote intention. So we have if your intention is to vote for the conservatives, that will increase, that has a lot of weight. Vote intention has a lot of weight, but it's not the only thing, by far. There are other drivers. The last thing is governmental approval, and governmental approval has an effect on this. So the voter expectation is explainable, and it's explainable by real things in the society and issues. It's not simply a projection of your particular preference. Here is something, it's a Granger causality model where we regress voter expectations as a function of voter expectations at t-1 plus vote intentions. And this is called a Granger causality model. And just and what you see, this is a very nice result. The fits are strong. Everything is as you'd expect. Intention makes a difference. Expectations makes twice as much of an impact. And this is a side note about Granger, who I know is a major figure in this group. And Harold Clark, who recently died, these data, by the way, much of it came from Harold Clark, who he was one of the heads of the British election study. He recently died. And he taught at Essex, University of Essex, and I would teach there. So he would always take us on econometric or statistical tours of England, and he would find an econometrician or something and find out where they lived, and then we would take a bus or a train over there, peer through the window. I mean, no, we didn't do that. But we would so one time we took a trip to, he said, I know where Granger lives, and we're going to go over there. So we got a group of political scientists and other nerds, and so we got in this, and it was summer, August in Essex. England is balmy and cool and everything. It was 95 degrees. We got on a bus. The bus had no air conditioning. The windows wouldn't open. The sun, it was tin bus. The sun was just beating down on this. And we set out for Granger's home. And we made it. So anyway, that's just a side note. So what you see here, this is quite interesting about the root of expectations. So I got a pièce de résistance after the conclusions here, and so I'm going to say, what do I say here now? So this does work. Citizen forecasting works. It's inexpensive. It's much less expensive than other kinds of survey methods. It works across democracies that we have studied. And we are doing this now. I'm involved with Deborah Leitner and Mary Stegmeyer. With some of you know about I should tell you, the Bertelsmann Foundation. But the Bertelsmann Foundation has it's a German foundation, and it had different projects, and one of them is they want to improve the functioning of democracy. So they thought that if they could help improve forecasting, it would be the democracies would work better. So we're working with them. They train. They have a group of participants that are interested in forecasting, and they regularly ask these people in their forecasting pool to forecast. And so they've added some questions. In particular, they've added many questions on our behalf. But they've added in particular this question: who do you think will win? And they're going to run this survey starting soon. They're going to run it regularly up to the next election. Okay? And to close, I'm going to show you. Now, this is I probably will regret this, but when I'm on wait a second. When I'm on an airplane, okay, here's something. When I'm on an airplane, if I don't want the person next to me to talk to me, I will tell them I'm a statistician. Then they'll never say anything. But sometimes I slip and I say I'm a political scientist, and they want to talk to me, and they say, well, who's going to win? And I say whatever I say, it doesn't matter. They just want to tell me who they think should win, and they don't care about my opinion. So it's anyway, my life has been a living hell. So people are always asking me about this. So Deborah Leitner and I we found a survey, and this spring, late April, we asked this one question here. I'll show you. Wait, this question is, this is a United States sample of citizens. I think a sample of about 1,000 U.S. citizens. Who do you think will win the 2024 presidential election? Okay, that's the question, and then these are the results. And what you see is that nobody got 50. This is nobody got 50%, but Biden is a slight, just a hair ahead of Trump. Although you see some of the other people or candidates, DeSantis has got some support. He's got more support than than Newsom, who's governor of California. So what you see from this is a really, well, it's going to be, if it's to be believed. Now, really you cannot, with polling, you can't, at least in the United States, you cannot predict an election if it's longer than a year away with polling data. So this just might be completely wrong. And I comfort myself that it's wrong in the direction that I hope it's wrong, but it might. I mean, we're gonna keep doing this, and so I'll stop there and take questions. Okay, thanks.
So we have a lot of time. Is the sound on? Yeah. We have a lot of time for questions. Are there questions in the audience? Oh, okay. So we start with questions up. Oh, Yael, can you give the microphone up there? No, there was sorry. It's not fair. There was a lady up there that was first. No? Wasn't there? No. That's the lady up there. No, so Nikos should be second.
I'll go back.
So I thought it was behind you, Nikos. Sorry for that.
Super interesting talk. Thank you very much. I'm just curious if you've thought of comparing results like this to, it's not legal in the United States, but you can bet on presidential elections if you're not in the United States, and so you can just Google and see what the implied probability is from the odds in other places. I'm just curious if you've ever thought to compare results like this against those.
Raise your hand. I can't see you. Oh, you're right there. Okay, so are you talking about betting markets?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the betting markets, they're particularly in Britain. It's really easy to bet on elections, and sometimes, and I know some of my colleagues, Britain has a lot of election forecasters, and they've made money. There are scholarly papers on this. Chris Walazian and Robert Erickson have done them. That's useful to bring this out. I look at scientific approaches. I mean, betting markets are interesting, but I don't consider that a scientific approach. I mean, it could be right, but there is work on it. Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Well, we'll do is Nikos and then
Thank you for the talk. The question I have is about the sampling of this. So you provide evidence that this works, but I was wondering, do we have any literature if, for instance, I would go on the street and ask people, or I would do it online, if there is a different effect on that?
I didn't get the last part.
So I can ask people online, for instance, to get a large sample, or I could go on the street and ask them. But then there will be a different effect on how I ask the question, and potentially also people give different expectations. Do we have any literature on that?
We have data on how you ask the question, and this is important to not lead the respondent. You want to phrase the question in a neutral way. So partly, and their experiment, one of the things you should say is, regardless of your own preferences, or setting aside your own preferences, what do you think will happen? But those of you who know survey research, you know this is a big problem about biasing. You don't want to push the respondent, and we have some different questions that we've looked at. There seems to be, there's not a lot of bias in that question. Unless it could be triggered, if it's embedded in a survey where it's all about how great Margaret Thatcher is, and then you get asked. I mean, you can be primed, but these are survey research questions. This question is this other thing. It's better to ask simple questions as opposed to complicated questions. Some people who are doing this really want to we're all smart, so we want to make this hard. But average people they're average, and they don't want, they respond better to simple questions. Actually, one of my hypotheses is that the simple questions work better than hard questions, where you start asking people to calculate the percentages, and then they're supposed to add up to, and then someone says they give everyone the 80% probability of winning, and that would total up to 360 or something. I personally, if I'm asked, should that be done, I say no. But people do it anyway. It can work. The French stuff, if you look at the literature, some of the studies in Germany and France are quite complicated in terms of what they expect the respondent to be able to calculate. But I would say err on the side of simplicity.
One just observation and then one question. So the observation is what you're doing with the citizen forecasting is very similar to what a large number of nonprofits in the United States do by bringing on what they refer to as citizen scientists. So these are people who are not professionally scientists, but they train them to do work for them, and of course it's free. And so they get, an immense multiplier effect from doing that. And you're gaining some from that here, and of course you might even be able to improve how you're doing it by looking at how these different organizations make use of citizen scientists. Now, the question has to do with the forecasts, and you've shown that you're getting a really high percentage of correct forecasts. But as forecasters, the way that we improve our forecasts is looking at when we get the forecasts wrong. So my question to you is, what were the instances in which it didn't work, and how might those be improved?
Yeah. I knew someone would ask that. Thank you for that. Yeah, because as good as the procedure is, it's not foolproof. It's nothing nothing is ever 100% in this world, as long as you're in this world. So, what should I say? One thing, if the race is very close, then sometimes it will be a tough call Because but if you think about it, let's say if it's mainly a two-party system, then if it looks like it's a horse race that neck and neck, then the forecaster might say it's too close to call. It's 51-49 or something like that. Now, statistically, that's a reasonable thing to say, and that's a reasonable thing to say if you're actually thinking about it. You're saying it's too close to call. It could go either way. That's a thoughtful response. And somebody, let's see, who was that? Yeah, Andrew Gelman said he'd throw out the cases that were close calls. And I think I would disagree with that because that's information. That's not a null forecast. That's a forecast. The forecast is going to be right on the line. That's a more common example. Now there is one. This is quite interesting. So there are limits to the notion that you don't have to have a probability sample. You have to have a heterogeneous, large enough sample. In other words, it has to have a mix of people and they're different. It doesn't have to be drawn like the American National Election Studies or the German election studies draw a probability sample, but it has to be a varied group. Now, some of you probably have, and Andreas and I did this with, how many of you know MTurk? Hold up your hands if you know MTurk. Oh, surely so. You just know MTurk. Okay. So we thought we would hire MTurk, which is an online thing, and they're online, they answer interviews. You ask them questions, and they answer the questions, any subject. So they're paid next to nothing. We actually paid more than we needed to pay. We set out a call on MTurk, paid more than they would normally be paid, and asked these questions. Big sample. And we also screened their backgrounds. We knew they lived in the state. We were doing this American states. This last election, we were doing the American states. We knew they lived in the state. We knew they had a bank account in the state. We knew we had a score from them on their interest in politics. We knew they had an address. I mean, in other words, we knew they were real people in these states. And it just bombed bad. And subsequently, there's been a big paper. I'm on the editorial board of Political Science Research and Methods. There's been a lot of papers about MTurk and whether or not it's useful. The general consensus is, it's not necessarily clear why, but it doesn't seem to, at least for this work, it does not work. So don't use MTurk. But the larger message is just, use your brain. I mean, if you can say, okay, not a probability sample, but is it a cross-section? Or are they all professors of sociology? Think about because that's a risk that you have some sort of screwball sample. But that's a useful point.
Yep.
The other thing is, I think that, and this I could be wrong on this is a hypothesis. I think that the simpler the question, the more accurate the forecasters will be. I think as you complicate the task, they start to think, and this relates to the citizen scientist thing, they start to think they're smart. And maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but they start to think, I know. And the more you think you know, that tends to push you in the other way. Okay, thanks for that.
Thank you. We're going to try to have a few more questions, so I'm going around still.
My understanding of why this works is that rather than sampling the individual, you're sampling that individual social network effectively, and that way you get a more representative sample. But I believe there is a tendency for people's social networks to become more segmented by political affiliation. So kind of conservatives are only hanging around with conservatives and progressives only with progressives.
Yeah.
So if that trend continues, would you expect this type of method to work poorly because you won't really have any difference between a person's intention and expectation?
Yeah. This is the problem of friendship groups as echo chambers. the more people become like everybody around them, the less new information they get. So you're right. I mean that, and there is some people are arguing there's a little bit of evidence testing that. It doesn't. It makes, for one thing, it makes each additional person in your social network an inefficient. It's a fraction of a person. You know, you're not really getting a whole new. They're not independent, and the less independent they are, the less useful it is. It makes it harder. Yeah. So. Yeah. Right. Good point.
So, somewhat related to that last question, in last couple of election cycles in the United States, there's been a rise, particularly on the conservative side, of the people that can style themselves as the silent majority. Kind of really, I guess there's some virtue signaling around the idea of I'm not going to reply to a survey because surveys are bunk. Have you seen that influencing your work at all?
Yeah. I would say that's what kept me up last night, except that what kept me up is jet lag. But that question drives me crazy. I mean, not your asking of it, the predicament. So, what is happening in sampling? This is a very deep problem. I was trained in the Leslie Kish tradition of sampling, very scientific, very mathematical. That's how you do sampling. You get a list of the population, you sample randomly from that list, you go interview those people, and then you'll be able to infer to the population. So this is getting harder and harder to do. And for example, and it's harder to do in terms of time, and it's also costly. Really, it's getting more and more costly. So I did a paper on this. Natalie Jackson, I want to mention. Natalie Jackson is a pollster and a political scientist, PhD, and a professor of political science, and she's at PRRI, Public Religion Research Institute. It's not religious. I don't know why that's the title. Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI. Natalie Jackson. She's well-trained as a scientist, and she's well-trained as a pollster. She and I have written papers on this problem of the quality of the samples. And so in the last election, 2020, we got a hold of every national poll we could put our hands on. It's about 300 going into the election, the U.S. election. They were all wrong. They were all wrong. And the average error was 5%, 5 percentage points on the popular vote, too high in favor of Biden. And they under-forecast Trump. Gross errors. These are gross errors. And it's across the board. So we said, well, maybe it's the polling methodology that the different ones use. So we looked at different, did they do face-to-face, interactive interviewing, modes, different kinds of sampling strategies. Did they sample from a registered voters list, or how do they, and none of the sampling procedures made any difference. Nothing. The only thing that made a difference was how close the survey was to the election. Now this is profoundly disturbing, because it says, and Natalie and I wrote another. These papers are published. If you write me, I'll tell you how to find them. They're published in scholarly outlets. We did the same kind of thing in 2016 when Hillary lost. The polling was terrible. Everybody said it would get fixed. It didn't get fixed. And what's going on? I mean, like pollsters. I mean, it's their job. You don't want to lose your job. I mean, who does? Nobody does. So there's an effort to try to make things work. But I would say, well, on the evidence, they're still bad. Look at and it's not just the United States. I mean, Britain. I mean, they poll all the time, and there's huge. The last few elections, huge errors in the polls. Huge. Same problem. And that's a bright spot for citizen forecasting. The 2019 election in Britain that everybody got way wrong, citizen forecasting got it exactly right. So that's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting. So how do you get at this problem of non-respondents? So you're saying, well, one hypothesis is that there are people, they're systematically not responding, and by that there may be they're just extreme right-wingers or whatever. I mean, there's some particular group that you can never reach, and they're partisan, and the partisan bias in that group makes a difference. I mean, that may be true, or it's very hard to say if it's true or not. I mean, that's the problem. In order to know if it's true, you got to go interview them and say, why don't you answer interviews? And then you're answering an interview. But there are some, I don't know if any of you are from Sweden or Norway. I mean, there's some work there. There's a guy at the University of Gothenburg who went door to door, basically kind of anthropology studies, going in neighborhoods that people don't like to go into, and he'd just knock on the door and talk to a lot of people. In other words, he was in places that you might say, these people in this neighborhood, they probably aren't going to answer a survey. So he was doing kind of old-fashioned anthropology. Here's a thought that it would be great for somebody who's younger than me. That would be all of you. You unobtrusive measures. Use unobtrusive measures. In other words, try to go to neighborhoods where you suspect that the refusal rate is high, and look in the neighborhoods. Look at the street signs. Look at the condition of the houses. Look at what's going on and what are the kids in the street doing. Take unobtrusive measures of that neighborhood, because those are social conditions that they live under. And then you will find out in that neighborhood what the voting, the precinct votes are. You'll find out how that neighborhood voted. So you might find that in neighborhoods with more garbage cans with their lids off, they're more, I don't know. But it's a feasible idea. I mean, it's intellectually feasible. Now you have to send interviewers into neighborhoods that, it used to be like, and when I was at Michigan, Go Blue, I was at Michigan, and the interviewers, the ideal interview was a middle-aged, middle-class white woman, because they could go just about anywhere. And now, but then there's questions about that, and what kind of, now the idea might be you are sending interviewers into neighborhoods where there might be risk for some reason, that's an issue. But I think this could be done, and somebody is probably, I hope someone in this room will actually you could get a grant money for this. And the theory of, some of you know the theory of unobtrusive measures. The thing you're studying, you measure it unobtrusively, and that way it's not, the people aren't reacting to it, but they are conditioned by it because they live there. Now, okay, another thing on this. I know that the Danish election study and the Swedish election study, and these people, those are the best two surveys in the world on elections, Swedish and the Danish. And I asked people there, how many people do you think don't ever answer a survey? Because they use strict probability sampling from lists, and they have lists of citizens, so you can get a nice, neat sample. So my Swedish friend said 30%. I said, what do you mean? I said, you mean 30% on the list don't answer? I said, no, 30% of the Swedes never answer, ever. I thought, hello, that's pretty shocking. And then so I asked my Danish friends, I said, the Swedes tell me, I'm not going to tell you the names of these people because I don't want to get them in trouble. Anyway, so my Danish friend said, my Swedish friend said 30%. What's in Denmark? He said 40%. So we have this, if you believe that, there's this vast pool of people who have no voice. It's like what Marx used to call the lumpen proletariat. They're out there, and they're not heard. It's really quite dramatic to think about this. And this problem only gets worse. And now, if we live in a polarized era, as some people think we do, then that will get worse. Now, I have one piece of bright news about polarization. Everybody thinks America is more and more polarized, but Helmut Norpoth, who's a forecaster, he's a well-known forecaster, we did a paper on polarization of the American electorate, the public, the mass, and measured that by how many more people were at the extremes. They're not more. It's a normal curve. Most of the people are in the middle. There are no more people at the left end or the right end. So that's good news. I mean, it's hard to believe. We published this. No one believes it. But in the people, let the people speak. The people that speak from the American National Election Study they're saying the same thing they said 20 years ago in terms of whether they're left or right or moderate. So that's huge. That's a huge finding. Where the polarization is at the top. It's in the legislatures, the leaders. The leaders are polarized. It's not the people's fault. It's the leaders. Yeah. Quicker? Well, that might not happen.
So a short question. I was wondering whether you have already evaluated the impact of sharing those forecasts prior to the election on the election outcome itself.
Yeah.
In France, we have very few people voting, in fact, less and less. And if you tell them that their party is going to win, they just say, oh, there's no more need for me to go voting, and it change the whole outcome of the election.
Yeah, that's a tempting hypothesis which doesn't hold up. I mean, partly because there's so many polls and so many people have so many different opinions. But that's a good question. It's just, there are some papers on that, but there's very little effect of that. Yeah.
There's a question up there? So thinking about prescription and thinking, like, have you ever have any thought about how to use your research to guide the future election, or maybe can even see some insights and can even can help like the politicians to make some decision or strategic policies or anything, and from there we can consider explainable AI. Thanks.
So, give me one sentence. I didn't hear all that. Just give me one sentence, or summarize that, or say it again. Something.
Prescription. Just thinking like what should they do after they have this research? Like how this can guide the future election.
Okay.
Rather than just the current prediction.
I guess one thing is I do have something on that. So about the future elections. Right now in the United States, people are worried about whether or not there will even be, whether or not Trump will manage to try to cancel the election. And I don't think that's going to happen for reasons I could talk about. But, for one reason, the culture of elections in the U.S. is pretty solid. So I don't think he will be able to cancel the elections. But right now, and this is a Virginia story, Thomas Jefferson, he founded this university. When he was elected president, the president was elected in the House of Representatives. There were 26 ballots. He was running against... it took him 26 ballots to beat Aaron Burr. He beat Aaron Burr by one vote. Now, Aaron Burr was a corrupt, dangerous, authoritarian. He was like a Trump. He was like Trump. If you read it, it's haunting. And Thomas Jefferson beat him just by one vote. So that's quite an interesting, I thought of that on the way down here. It's a very local kind of thing. But you know, the future can turn on a dime. You could get, you know, a narrow election, but that's something I worry about. I just, you know, if you're interested in political history, that's quite an interesting story. Yeah.
Just a last quick question. Very quick. You know, I remember in American election when Biden won, there's one survey out of USC, University of Southern California, they got it right. And the only difference in that survey was that was a panel survey. That is, they surveyed the same people repeatedly, and they said they got it right because initially a lot of people were not truthful in saying that they're going to vote for Trump, but we repeatedly asked after a couple of times, they start telling the truth. And as a result, that was the only survey in America that got it right that the Trump would be winning. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, one comment is that if you have 300 surveys, one of them is going to be right. I mean, just statistically. And so that's a big problem. There will be someone, you know, if you throw darts at the dartboard all day long, you'll have a lot of bullseyes. So that would be something worth pursuing. And one of the things that people are pursuing is training people to be forecasters. The jury's still out on that. I don't really... I think if you consciously train people to be good, they might become not so good because they start to think well of themselves, too well of themselves. Or they overthink stuff. How many times have you overthought something and then you ended up if you'd have just done the first thing? But these are useful questions. I mean, okay. I'll be happy to talk.
I think we need to close, and I need to thank you so much for this intervention this morning. It was a great talk and an amazing discussion. Thank you so much for all your questions. I think we learned a lot about political forecasting today. So thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I think we can move on now to our next activities, and I give a little present to our speaker.
Oh, okay.
Thanks so much, Mike.
Thanks.
That was so interesting.
Is that okay?
Yeah. That was so interesting. Yeah, we should make a pitch.